items that maybe is a bit more surprising and that some of you may not be aware of. For example, a set of concentration camp guides and tourist postcards from the post-war period, including several items from Auschwitz collecting during the 1980s, which are very interesting. As I've mentioned, the focus of today's symposium is the Holocaust in Eastern Europe, and this is a centrally important topic, of course, for the library's work. It's partly through Professor Polonsky's contribution that the library is such a vital resource for those wishing to study the Holocaust in Eastern Europe in depth. And today we have a wide range of exciting and groundbreaking papers, which demonstrates how much vitality there is in the research currently underway in this field. On behalf of the library, I want to welcome you all, especially the speakers who we'll be hearing from today. I want to thank you all for your participation and wish everyone the best with their work and their research while we're waiting for the opportunity to welcome you back in person to Russell Square, to our reading room. We're looking forward to being open once again this summer, we hope, and we are currently hosting an exhibition entitled Death Marches, Evidence and Memory, which has been co-curated by Christine Schmidt, who's one of the organisers of today's event, the Deputy Director and Head of Research at the library. So I'd like to say thank you to her and also to the other organisers of today's event, Professor Francois Guénet and also Michael Fleming. Before I introduce Professor Guénet, I also wanted to note, however, an interesting centenary that's approaching this Saturday that perhaps suggests that this symposium is especially timely. On March the 20th, 1921, a plebiscite was held in Upper Silesia that was to result in an uprising, a border war, and an international conference attempting to regulate minority rights in the wake of devastation of World War I. The fact that this episode had such far-reaching consequences, but is so little known outside specialists in the field, perhaps suggests something about the continuing need to focus attention on scholarship of Eastern Europe and the Holocaust in Eastern Europe. So that's precisely what we're going to do today, and it's with great pleasure that I'm opening today's proceedings. But I do have a few points of housekeeping to make before we begin. The first thing to say is that we're going to be using the same Zoom link for the entire day. So please do feel free to come and go, and if you do leave and then want to come back in, you'll be using exactly the same Zoom link. The majority of people will be muted, apart from the speaker, of course, and that will help us to make sure that we're able to concentrate as much as possible on what's being said. So all questions and queries to the panelists should be made via the chat function. The chat function can be found at the bottom of the screen. It's the third button along. You just need to click on that and then type in to everyone your question, and that will be picked up by the chair. Chairs will attempt to accommodate as many questions as possible, but we are also working to a timetable today. So it could be that we aren't able to accommodate every question. So we apologise for that if that does happen, but we will try to do so. If you want to make any technical queries via the chat, same kind goes for that. We're going to do our best to help. We're not technical wizards with Zoom, but we will hopefully be able to provide some assistance. So the remarks of the speakers and the papers are going to be recorded and made available on YouTube, but your camera and name will not appear in that recording. So you don't have to worry too much about that, but of course you're welcome to switch your camera off if you want to do so. So now that the housekeeping is done, I think we're almost ready to begin. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Francois Guénet. Francois Guénet is Professor of Modern Jewish History in the Department of Hebrew and Jewish Studies at University College London. He holds a PhD in Modern History from Freiburg University, and he specialises in the early modern and 19th century history of Eastern Europe, and more specifically on Polish Jews. He's co-chair of the editorial board of Poland, Studies in Polish Jewry, and currently serves as Honorary Secretary of the European Association for Jewish Studies. He's the author of several monographs, articles, and edited volumes, and these include, perhaps most pertinently for today's purposes, The Jewish Metropolis, Studies in Honor of the 70th birthday of Professor Antony Polonsky. Francois.
Thank you. Thank you, Toby, for this introduction and for this welcome. Welcome to you all in the audience. Welcome to Antony Polonsky, obviously, whom we celebrate today. And thank you so much to Toby and Christine of the Wiener Holocaust Library for having worked since quite a time towards this event, which was obviously planned as an in-person conference at the library, and we rescheduled because of the pandemic and rescheduled once more. But because we all have been on such a steep learning curve in matters of electronic communication, I trust that we will have today a very productive and rich workshop celebrating Antony's achievements and his contribution to Holocaust research. My name is François Guénet, as I was already introduced, thank you. So I'm delighted to have this event today in celebration of Antony. Antony is the founder of the Institute of Polish-Jewish Studies, going back to a conference in 1986 in Oxford, and one of the major agencies in allowing us to understand the legacy and wealth of Eastern European Jewish history and civilization. Antony is also the founder of the yearbook Polin, Studies in Polish Jewry, and offering an extremely rich range of perspectives on Jewish history in Eastern Europe. As co-chair of the editorial board, I can assure that Polin is, as a publication, extremely wide range. The next volume will be dedicated to Jewish self-government in Eastern Europe, the one following on Jews, Poles, and the land of Israel, the one which follows on Jewish childhood, followed by one about Jewish, German Jewish, and Polish Jewish culture. So Polin is really embracing the entire legacy of Eastern European Jewish culture. All this would not be possible with the unique and oftentimes baffling expertise of Antony Polonsky. And it is a great privilege of my professional trajectory to be working so closely with such an accomplished scholar. We are also celebrating today a public intellectual who very closely follows historical debates in Poland. Toby just mentioned the Jedwabne debate after 2000, after the publication of Jan Tomasz Gross's study in 2000, Sąsiedzi, neighbors, but also in other places in Eastern Europe. Lithuania comes to mind, but also Russia. Antony follows these debates with a discerning and critical mind, and intervenes on many occasions in his capacity as a scholar. And one of the most central features here, one of the most central topics, obviously, is the terrible legacy of warfare and genocide. And with Antony's contribution to this topic, we are going to engage today. Finally, we are celebrating the Enlightener. Antony has been a central figure in allowing for the establishment of the Jewish Museum in Warsaw, Polin. We have colleagues from the museum in our audience today and among the speakers, and his contribution to this major undertaking cannot be overstated. It is lovely to see the former director, Dario Stola, among the speakers today. In the course of the day, I will mention the possibility to now join the Institute for Polish-Jewish Studies as a member. We have a new membership scheme, and I would be delighted if you would consider joining this new scheme. I will put this in the chat at a later stage. Without further ado, I hand over to my colleague, Michael Fleming, who will introduce Antony Polonsky as a Holocaust historian. Thank you.
Thank you, Francois. I'm Michael Fleming. I'm the Conference Secretary of the Institute of Polish-Jewish Studies, and it's my great honor to say a few words about Antony Polonsky and his immense contribution to Holocaust scholarship over several decades. And I think what we can do is we can think about his contribution in three distinct areas. First of all, of course, his written publications, books, articles. We can also think about his contribution in relation to formal education, specifically the lecture room, the seminar room, the classroom, and the number of scholars who have been influenced or have learnt from him over, as I say, several decades, from early dissertations related to Poland and Polish-Jewish relations to the more recent work or dissertations which have focused on works by people like Wojtek Rapak on Jan Karski. We can also think about Professor Polonsky's public engagements, and here we can think about his work at Polin, his work at the as chief historian, and of course his work with the Institute for Polish-Jewish Studies. So we've got three distinct areas that we can consider. In relation to his publication, I'd just like to draw your attention to three very important books which came out over the last 40 years or so. The first one, of course, is My Brother's Keeper, which explored debates on the Holocaust in Poland just as the communist system was coming to an end in the wake of the discussions about Jan Błącki's very important, I think it's 1989 article. And you can also think about his work as editor of volume 13 of Polin, which focused on the Holocaust and its aftermath, which was a very important intervention. And more recently, as editor, co-editor with one of our speakers today, Joanna Mischlitz, on The Neighbors Respond and the Neighbors and the controversy over Jedwabne. Now, what all these interventions demonstrate is this commitment to serious, rigorous, sophisticated scholarship, which eschews easy myths and comforting tales about the past. And one of the things that we'll discover today is that type of scholarship is coming under some pressure, not only in Poland, but elsewhere in Europe. And I think what Polonsky's contribution has shown and what he's done is the critical importance of shining light at the dark past without fear or favor. So now we will hear a few words from Professor Polonsky himself, and I pass over to you, Antony. Thank you.
Antony, I think you'll need to unmute. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, Francois, and indeed Toby Simpson for these very kind words. I feel very humbled and honored by this tribute and indeed by the symposium which you've organized in my honor today on the Holocaust in Eastern Europe. This is an important topic, and as Michael pointed out, it has become even more timely in the face of widespread attempts in Europe to rewrite the history of the Holocaust in a way that is more compatible with a favorable self-image of the countries in which it was implemented. I very much look forward today to a fruitful and open discussion of the difficult questions raised by the Nazi occupation of Eastern Europe. And I would stress that we are looking at the whole of Eastern Europe, that a comparative study is crucial in understanding these issues and in coming to terms with them. And I hope that the discussions today will enable us in particular to foster a more civil discussion of these complex, difficult and contested aspects of the history of the Second World War. In concluding, I'd just like again to thank the organizers of this event, Toby Simpson, director of the Wiener Holocaust Library, Christine Schmidt, the deputy director and head of research, Francois Guenet, a very good colleague, professor of modern Jewish history at the Department of Hebrew and Jewish Studies at UCL and chairman of the Institute of Polish Jewish Studies, and Michael Fleming, both a conference organizer of the Institute for Polish Jewish Studies and a historian at the Polish University abroad. Finally, I would also just like to mention Sarah Ben Isaac and Susan Storing, who have worked tirelessly to make sure that everybody could be registered for this event and that this event could take place without any technical hitches, which often, as we have learned in the last few months, mar such discussions. And so I wish everybody a fruitful discussion, and I very much look forward to hearing what everybody has to say and indeed to participating in this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Christine, I don't know if you wanted to take us to the next step.
Yes, I think it's now time. We're actually right on time, actually even 3 minutes early to start with our first panel. So welcome everyone. My name is Christine Schmidt and I'm the Deputy Director and Head of Research at the Wiener Holocaust Library. I'm also very pleased to welcome everyone to today's symposium in honor of Antony Polonsky. And I've been honored to co-convene this symposium with Francois and Michael. Our first session focuses on a range of sources that examine understudied aspects of the history. Each of our esteemed speakers will have about 20 to 25 minutes to present their papers, and then we'll take questions from the chat after the formal remarks conclude. I'll introduce the speakers and topics now, but you can find out more about their research and about their biographies in the program, which we've linked in the chat. So please feel free to send questions throughout the talk into the chat. It won't be distracting because it's being funneled to the panelists, and we will take them as we can after the papers are presented. So our first paper will be presented by Dr. Katarzyna Person, Assistant Professor at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, who examines the emblematic Ringelblum collection that offers remarkable insight into the life and death in the Warsaw Ghetto, including from perspectives of those whose voices are not usually captured in the archival record. We'll then hear from Hannah Wilson, who is a PhD student in the Department of History at Nottingham Trent University, who examines the impact of archaeological research at the Sobibor site on the historiography and memory of Sobibor. And finally, our third paper will be presented by Dr. Agnieszka Wierzcholska, who is based at the Institute for East European Studies at the Freie Universität in Berlin, and whose microhistorical study on Tarnov addresses controversial issues such as the role of the Poles as quote-unquote bystanders, or the question of Jewish agency in the process of rescue and flight. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to our first speaker, Katarzyna.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Thank you. I'm absolutely delighted, of course, to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the organizers, and of course to Professor Polonsky, without whom we wouldn't be here. That's the string. Just this. Okay, so I'll be speaking today about the Ringlem Archive and the voices from the Ringlem Archive, about listening to them and not listening to them, and choosing how we should be listening to them. And I'll start with a quote, which you can see on the screen. It comes from Herz Wasser, who was the secretary of the archive, and he wrote this just after the unearthing of the first part of the archive in September 1946. And he wrote, "It's difficult for me to write about the recovery of Dr. Emanuel's Ringelblum archive from under the rubble of the Warsaw Ghetto without emotion, not only because I had the honor of being one of his closest associates, of participating in gathering, storing, and securing historical materials for future researchers, but also mainly because the documents that have been saved will serve to reconstruct this period of martyrdom and heroism." And this quote very much frames what I want to speak about today. So how the voices recovered in the Ringlem Archive were recovered, how people were listened to them, what were the limits of listening to them, and what was, I think this is what's really the most important part here, the emotional involvement of those who were involved in this endeavor. And I'll be speaking mainly about work which was carried out by the Central Jewish Historical Commission and then by the Jewish Historical Institute. The Central Jewish Historical Commission was set up in 1944 in Lublin, and its primary task was
Katarzyna, you seem to have muted. I wonder if you could unmute. I'm not. I'll just check in with Christine to see if we've. There we are. Perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay. So should I? Okay.
You were only muted for a minute or so.
Okay. So let's start. Yes. So the Central Jewish Historical Commission, set up in Lublin in 1944, was with local commissions in other major Polish cities, was an organization with major task was gathering testimonies and other material related to the Holocaust and publishing both primary sources and research dedicated to the Jewish history and in particular Holocaust in occupied Poland. The newly created commission began its work with great gusto, supported by those members of the Jewish community who envisaged rebuilding Jewish communal life in Poland. Even though Philip Friedman, who was the first director of the commission, postulated that it should be objective and reconstruct facts on the basis of available archival material, it was mainly because of its members' deep personal involvement and emotional involvement that the commission carried out its work, despite extremely difficult political, material, and emotional conditions and very little financial support. Noah Grus was one of the members of the commission, wrote in a report on 1 year of the commission's work. We began creating knowledge of the Holocaust in Poland, not only for its own sake, but also as a monument to our fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters. And this is really very much what the commission was about commemoration, murdered fellow members of the community, but also about retribution. That's another important aspect of it. So about gathering testimonies and documentation which could bring perpetrators who are still alive to justice. And this is something that's also very clearly present in the works of the Ringlem Archive, the underground archive, the Warsaw Ghetto. Those two aspects. Firstly, commemoration, bringing back names and commemorating people who otherwise wouldn't be remembered. And secondly, calling for justice for them, making sure that crimes against them were not forgotten. Justice understood here in many ways, but that undoubtedly also appears in the work of the Ringlem Archive. And in that sense, the commission continued their work. In the flurry of post-war documentational activities, that's always the same picture of Ringelblum, the particular importance was of course placed on the Ringlem Archive and the search for Ringelblum Archive. That was the collection that, after almost total destruction of Warsaw Jewish community, was considered to be of utmost historical, judicial, and symbolic importance. The Ringlem Archive, the underground archive, the Warsaw Ghetto, was established by Emanuel Ringelblum, who enlisted approximately 50 to 60 people, journalists, economists, teachers, rabbis, leading personalities, among them of social resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto, to create a clandestine research group operating under the name of Onek Shabbat or Onek Shabbos. What they created together was a collection of documents documenting Jewish life and death in Nazi-occupied Poland. The collection, as you know, were concealed in two parts. The first one in August 1942, the second one in February 1943 at Nowolipki 68. The collection contained altogether over 2,000 documents written in Polish, Yiddish, Hebrew, and German. You can see one of them here. This is part of Ringelblum's diary. And as you look at it, please think fondly of those who are editing those documents and preparing them for publication, especially translators. So among those documents were testimonies, diaries, accounts from approximately 300 Jewish communities from the whole territory of occupied Poland, school essay research works, and also official German documents such as identity cards, food ration cards, posters, also about 70 photographs and 300 drawings and paintings. The work on unearthing the Ringelblum Archive began almost immediately after the end of the war in Warsaw, where the surviving ghetto activists began petitioning the Central Jewish Struggle Commission to unearth the archive. But it was only really with the return to Warsaw of Herr Wasser, who already mentioned, the secretary of the archive, and one of the very few people who knew where the archive was actually hidden, that actual work on unearthing the archive began. However, with very limited resources, the search became extremely complicated. It was, of course, not enough just to pinpoint the place where the archive was hidden, which Wasser could do. With the ghetto razed to the ground, unearthing documents was a major undertaking that required also necessary permits, finding the right place among the ghetto ruins, finding the right way and method of excavating, and finally, of course, the key issue, having enough money to do so. And considering the position of the Jewish community in immediate post-war Poland and the situation with post-war Poland altogether, this, of course, was a key problem. Even though the Central Commission began immediately looking for money, the surviving post-war Jewish community simply could not afford to carry out the works. Interestingly, in order to finance the excavation, the Commission went as far as to take out loans, even putting up Jewish communal property as collateral. And that's a really big step. In May 1945, they decided to sell the shipment of coffee, which they received from abroad, in order to finance the excavations. But it was only really in the beginning of 46, with money coming from abroad, from Jewish organizations abroad, that the work was actually properly began to be carried out. And then the archive was found in September 46, the first part, and then the second part by chance in December 1950. And as you probably know, the second part actually is better preserved because it was contained in milk churns, as opposed to the first part in metal boxes, which was much more destroyed by elements. But what really is fascinating here is that if we take into account how difficult those immediate post-war years were, that against the backdrop of war trauma, of anti-Semitic violence, of a mass emigration, the effort the remnant of the Jewish community invested in unearthing the archive was truly enormous. In this regard, I think it can be claimed, and it sounds maybe a bit far-fetched, but I think it actually was true, and this also, I think, comes out from the personal writings, is that many of those researchers who were involved in work on the Ringlem Archive immediately after the war did really see themselves as continuing the work which was begun by Emanuel Ringelblum. And in a way, they had right to do so. Early researchers on the archive, Joseph Kermisch or Isaiah Trank, Arthur Eisenbach, were all people coming, of course, from the same scholarly milieu. Some of them also had personal links with Ringelblum, and they could, rightly so, feel that they are actually continuing his work.
I didn't know that Eisenbach had links with him.
Probably the most clear, this is the unearthing of the archive, the most famous picture from that moment. Probably the most clear-cut example of how those people saw themselves as responsible for the archive was the work of Hersch Wasser, the secretary of the archive, already mentioned twice, who considered himself very much the custodian of the archive, and who assumed personal responsibility for working on the archive immediately after it was found. This was understandable. He was the secretary of Ringelblum. He was the only person who was able to decipher the code used to mark documents in the archive. So he was actually able to describe them, able to say who wrote what. But he also went a step further when it comes to securing the archive. Between the spring of and autumn of 1947, Wasser sent 140 documents from the archive to Iwo in New York. He sent them illegally, understandably. He didn't have any right to do so. He took those documents secretly, probably during indexing. He sent, and we know that because those envelopes are preserved in Iwo in New York, he sent every batch of documents from a different post office using a different alias on every envelope. So what he did was still very much a continuation of underground work. There's no doubt about it. This was still very much an extension of what he did working in the underground in the Warsaw Ghetto, and this is clearly how he perceived it. However, in a letter sent to Iwo, which were the letters he sent also preserved in Iwo archive, are also written in code. He wrote that he was to a large degree motivated by the desire to safeguard the contents of the archive in light of the changing political situation in Poland. And his fears were, of course, not groundless. In October 1947, with the acceleration of centralization for the country, with the consolidation of communist power in Poland, the Central Commission was transformed. The Jewish Historical Institute was no longer around the country was now all centralized in Warsaw, where it could be better controlled. And in the new institution, the curatorship of the Ringlem Archive remained a key element validating its existence. So from the very beginning, commentators from newly established Jewish Circle Institute were commenting on the importance of the archive, on its importance for historical research, which is to this day undeniable, and especially when it comes to research on civilian experience of the Holocaust, but also on events which are often missed in post-war testimonies, even immediate post-war testimonies. So those events from the very, very early stages of the war, which might seem insignificant to those testifying later after the war, but which seemed crucial in 1940, 1941. For example, the Easter pogrom in Warsaw, very often missed from post-war testimonies, but one which takes quite a position of prominence in the Ringlem Archive. So this was the scholarly aspect of it, but there was also a personal one, which met with the scholarly, and that was the fact that the archive gave voice to the people who were murdered during the Holocaust, and who, of course, whose voices would have otherwise disappeared. But the question which arose immediately, and I think that's one that probably important to this day, but at that point really was crucial, was to what extent we are ready to listen to those voices, and to what extent we are ready to share them with the rest of the community. And this is because, as all of you who know Ringlem Archive and who read those documents know, this is not necessarily an easy reading. A fragment of Ringlem's diary regarding the activity of Onek Shabbat reads, the main principle is probably the most famous of his quotes regarding Onek Shabbat, but also one that is really crucial, is that the main principle of activity was to be comprehensive. Our second principle was objectivity. We were trying to tell the whole truth, no matter how bitter. Our photographs are faithful, unretouched. And this, of course, means that while the archive speaks of heroism and is a monument to Jewish heroism during the Holocaust, it speaks of extreme will to survive, of durability of social links, pre-war social links, and those which are created in the ghettos, which very clearly stays away from generalizations, which tries to find both positive and negatives, even if such difficult topics as, for example, the activities of the Jewish Order Service, the activities of the Judenrat. At the same time, it also does not shy away from the dark sides of life under occupation. And as historian David Roskis has observed, no later texts about the Holocaust, about the ghetto reality, were as brutal as those which were written for the archive. And indeed, the language which was used to describe Jewish life during the Holocaust in many of those documents is very difficult to accept even today, and even more so must have been for the survivors. And as an example of it, I'll just very briefly mention two texts actually, written by Stanisław Różycki, who was one of the collaborators of the archive, an extremely talented writer. They actually both translated in Polish and available in online. Sorry, in English, not into Polish, into English, from Polish into English, and available online. And those texts entitled Ulica, so the street, and Obrazki uliczne, street scenes from the ghetto, speak about the space, entering the space of the ghetto street. And the ghetto street in Różycki texts is shown as a place of a fierce struggle for survival, as a place where people are fighting to live, where there's no place for morality, where there's no place for any sort of social ties which simply cannot withstand the brutality of everyday life. And summing up his text, Różycki, as you can see here on screen, writes, the reader might be struck by this overtly one-sided, bleak and negative depiction, dark colors only, nothing positive, lofty or noble. I observe the street closely and I know it like the back of my hand. I did my best to find some noble sides to its life too, for there must be some, but I do not know, and except for some individual instances, I have not seen any. Maybe others will. I have not been so lucky, and I wholeheartedly wish others more luck, faith, and hope in the search. Of course, it can be said that the very existence of Różycki's text, the very existence of the archive, but Różycki's text as well, shows us that there were lofty, noble, and positive aspects and values in the ghetto life. But the question which arose to those who were reading those documents in 1946 and then in 1950 was, of course, how they should be published and how they should be, whether they should actually be shown to the public. And the publishing activity of the Jewish Historical Institute throughout late 1940s, 1950s as well, shows very clearly that those people, those researchers decided to publish them and decided to share them at a price. And the price which they were ready to pay was that, of course, of censoring those documents quite thoroughly. And we can speak here about two types of censorship. The first one, when we look at those first publications from the ghetto, is the most obvious one. That's the political censorship, which had to be introduced in anything that was published at that point in Poland. So in those texts published probably up to early 1980s, we won't find information about Polish violence against Jews. But we also won't find information about non-communist Polish underground, about Polish government in exile, about the Western Allies. These were all understandably cut out. This was the price that the Institute was saw as worth paying for publication, and also probably worth paying for keeping this last, at that point, communal Jewish voice in Poland alive. However, there was also another type of censorship, and that's the one which again ties in the emotional aspect of research on the archive, and one that I find really interesting and one that I think should be further researched. And these are the changes which were introduced not because of the expectations of the communist regime, but these were choices which were changes which were introduced by the editors and by the publishers on their own initiative. So those were censorship choices regarding the so-called difficult aspects of life in an occupied city, such as, for example, sexual violence against women, but also other aspects of civilian experience of social tensions within the community. And many of these topics were also cut out from the publications which appeared in late 1940s and in 1950s as well. Well, basically up to 1980s. This type of censorship dealt mainly with the internal Jewish issues of the Jewish community during the Holocaust. These were the topics which Christopher Browning described as secret or communal, so as opposed to private. So topics which were not transferred to people from outside the immediate circle of survivors, in this case, immediate circle of researchers on the Ringlem Archive. And there was often conviction behind that only people who lived through it were able to experience it firsthand, who experienced firsthand were able to understand it. And the fascinating part of it, of course, is that these were not changes just made in Polish language editions of the archive. These changes also appeared in Yiddish language publications, which is quite contrary to what we normally know of the Yiddish version of a text regarding the Holocaust being the real one and then the slightly censored version for the outsiders. This wasn't so. They were also carried out in the Yiddish publications, so we can claim that they were not made in order to safeguard the image of Jews in the eyes of the Polish society. They were made purely with the Jewish community in mind, and in service to those who consider themselves to be leaders of the community and those who are keeping the appropriate image of the Holocaust and how it was to be cultivated. And to sum up, to finish now, at the end of July 1942, at the height of deportation actions from the Warsaw Ghetto, Abraham Levin, one of the members of the Onek Shabbat, wrote in his diary, and I quote, "A meeting of Onek Shabbat, its tragic character. They discussed the question of ownership and the transfer of the Ringlem Archive to America to the Evo, if we all die. A month later, David Graber, a teenager, who was given the task of hiding the archive, expressed his hope in his last will and testament that the archive will be deposited in the quote-unquote free Palestine. Although they named different places, both Levin and Graber saw the future of the archive outside Poland, foreseeing the demise of Polish Jewry. Instead, the archive remained in Poland, under the custodial care of the last remnants of the community. Although it mirrored the community faith, and in many aspects failed victim to the changing tides of politics, it nonetheless remained intact and safeguarded. And I would claim that it is thanks to those individuals, those researchers who I mentioned at the very beginning, and then many others following that, who dedicated their professional and personal lives to work on the archive. And then in turn, the archive, among the destruction of the Holocaust, served as a proof of the continuity of Jewish life in Poland. Thank you.
Thank you, Katarzyna. That was a tremendously rich presentation on the content of the archive and the challenges of reading it, I think, both in the post-war period and today. And you've effectively presented the multiple, I think, layers of mediation through translation and dissemination. I think it would make for a very interesting conversation once we hear from our other two speakers as well, and to think about these themes as they present them from their perspective on the other sources that they are using. So we've had a couple very specific questions to you in the chat, but I think we'll save those until after the other presentations, just to make sure that we gather everybody's questions. And sometimes it takes people a little more time to kind of think through, so we have time for everybody. So I'm going to hand over now to Hannah Wilson, who's going to be talking about her research on Sobibor. And I'm going to share her presentation, and I'll be sort of advancing them because we have some technical challenges, Hannah, and I think it should be fine. But I'm going to mute myself and I will hand over to you.
Okay, so thank you so much to the organizers, my fellow presenters, and of course, Antony Polonsky for allowing me to be part of this fascinating event today. And thank you to Christine for managing my PowerPoint. So if we can go to the next slide, please. I first arrived at the site of the former Nazi death camp Sobibor in eastern Poland in 2014 to join the archaeological excavations taking place that summer. Guided by archaeologists, I stepped off the public path into the surrounding woodland and was disturbed to find gnarled, rusted barbed wire crudely wrapped around thick tree trunks. Back by the circular memorial mound, I kneeled closer to the sandy grass only to discover fragments of ash and cremated bone. The following day, I joined the team to dig and sift the earth in the area of the remains of the gas chambers. There on the makeshift metal sieve gleamed a pearl and silver earring standing out against the rock and the debris. And some 70 years later on, that day, I held in my hand tangible evidence of a murdered being, a sign of personal expression, identity, and womanhood. The owner of these beautiful earrings had chosen to wear this pair, perhaps her favorite, on the day she would be killed at Sobibor. Next slide, please. In his articles, Bones Never Lie, Unearthing Europe's Age and Terror of Age and Memory, Rob van der Laas emphasized, while personal memories might travel, the sites themselves are mostly fixed within local and national canons of memory. Many material remnants and findings of conflicts are trapped in such a state of in-between. The former site of Sobibor Death Camp is one such place, remote, quiet, and enclosed by nature. Yet the deceptive beauty of its surrounding woodland and its few neighboring residents can never conceal the terrible and violent history of this site. Sobibor is a space that has witnessed extreme violence, politicization, depoliticization, and even repoliticization as a result of the more recent archaeological, material, and museological developments. Through various stages of preservation and commemoration, the site has been transformed from a space of non-memory or a terrorscape into a place of remembrance and mourning. Yet only recently has the narrative of Sobibor Death Camp started to integrate into the narrative of Holocaust memory as we now know it, with a stronger focus on perpetration, memorialization, touristification, and excavation. For years, it had remained on the periphery. But it is precisely this absence of memory and materiality that stimulated the forensic and material turn at the site in the early 2000s. This has been embodied by a 10-year period of forensic archaeological excavations, as well as the decision of the Polish state in 2011 to build a new museum and memorial in coordination with an international steering committee. So following years of neglect and contested memorialization, archaeologists also began to shed new light on public memory and the collective consciousness of Sobibor. Not only has this form of research revealed further physical evidence of topographical camp structures, but it's also helped to restore the memory of those victims who did not survive, to tell their experiences through objects and fragmented material traces. While there is evidence of archaeological work taking place on the site of Auschwitz-Birkenau as early as 1962, excavations at Holocaust sites generally have evolved into their own forensic discipline from the 1980s onward. By utilizing traditional methods of historical and combat archaeology, the field of Holocaust archaeology approaches the memory, material culture, and preservation of sites of this specific conflict. Much like the revision and shift of commemorative narratives at former campsites in Poland, forensic work can be also understood within the broader context of changing transnational perspectives on Holocaust heritage. So concerning the Reinhardt Camps specifically, excavations began at Chełmno in 1987, while British archaeologist Caroline Sturdy-Coles has performed multiple excavations at the site of Treblinka. While Belzec was also investigated for a short period of time, the vast memorial that was built there prevented any further excavations being done on site. So at Sobibor, the first excavations were led in 2000 to 2001 by Professor Andrzej Koller of the Nicolaus Copernicus University in Torun, who used the particularly invasive method and contested method of drilling. As archaeologist Isaac Gilead notes, that Koller was allowed to drill mass graves is considered by Orthodox Jews a monumental failure. Through this method, however, his team found the mass graves and the remnants of 5 structures, as well as approximately 873 artifacts, which were transferred for conservation to the Majdanek State Museum, though not much of his work was actually published. American professor Richard Freund also conducted some small excavations at the site from the University of Hartford using only geophysics. In this paper, however, I focus specifically on the excavations that I've been involved with personally, and the role of the archaeologists at Sobibor and the material culture unearthed there. Indeed, the wide scale of excavations at Sobibor have been the largest of any former death camp, and most importantly, have created a substantial archive of objects from below the ground. So in 2007, on behalf of the Ben-Gurion University, Yad Vashem, and the Wadowa Museum, Polish archaeologist Wojciech Mazurek and Israeli archaeologist Yoram Chaimi began working together to try and uncover as much physical information regarding the site as possible. So Mazurek of the Subterra Archaeological Research Center in Helm had already completed some non-invasive geophysics at Sobibor in 2004. Chaimi of the Israel Antiquities Authority had personally lost family members there, including 2 of his cousins from his mother's side who'd been born in Morocco, so this was the main motivation for his involvement. Archaeological research at the site of Sobibor extermination camps allowed us to physically touch the Holocaust beyond the limited evidence provided by historical documents, for which there are few. The excavations enable us to reconstruct the camp accurately, and uncovering the artifacts allows us to discover more of its victim stories. So alongside a team of skilled local workers, including Mazurek's own sons, the archaeologists referred to a wider variety of historical sources, such as maps, sketches, drawings, aerial photographs, as well as the accounts of Sobibor witnesses as a basis for their research. So Chaimi was able to consult personally with Yehuda Lerner and Simcha Bialowicz, who were living in Israel at the time. They both survived Sobibor, while Simcha's brother Philip Bialowicz was even able to visit the excavations himself. And though many visitors came to the site during the excavations, including the relatives of Sobibor victims, myself and American filmmaker Gary Hockman were permitted as unofficial members of the excavation team. And as the project unfolded, a very strong working relationship formed between Chaimi and Mazurek, who were able to bring different historical backgrounds and investigative methods to the excavations. So from my perspective, this has also contributed to the strength of the investigation, alongside the hard work of their team members. The high level of trust and support between the international actors involved, both Jewish and non-Jewish, allowed for deeper communication and understanding of what was being unearthed, what their findings might represent for the memory of the site, and ways to disseminate this knowledge to the wider public. So can I have the next slide, please? Initially, Chaimi and Mazurek's goal had been to reconstruct the original plan of the campsite, the former details of which had been insufficient and inaccurate, despite previous investigations and scientific research. The team has since excavated a huge amount of the terrain of the site, and the excavations have successfully uncovered the remains of the former location of several important camp features, including the correct location of the Himmelfahrstrasse, the road to heaven, in 2011, the female haircutting barracks, the original railway ramp constructed with the camp, the Sonderkommando barracks, a number of previously undetermined graves, and even the traces of a failed escape tunnel. Excavations in Camp 1 and 2 revealed buildings and refuse pits full of wartime artifacts used by the Travniki gods and the undressing area of new arrivals. Further investigations in Camp 3 in the mass grave area uncovered newer pits of bone and ash fragments, possibly from the cremation of camp inmates who did not escape during the camp uprising on the 14th of October 1943. An area in which approximately 1,830 bullet casings were found also revealed a shooting range, possibly for the prisoners who were unable to make it to the gas chambers. So indeed, the methodological digging in excavation squares conducted by Mazurek and Jaime's team provided the new forensic framework of research at the site and provided hope for future discoveries. Though comparatively this process is time-consuming and requires extensive physical labor, it has also allowed for more intricate findings to be made and to better trace soil inconsistencies below ground. So we can go to the next slide, please. And then the next slide, please. So the archaeologists at Sobibor have also faced the challenge of the natural landscape. Time is spent cutting down trees, removing roots, and burning foliage. They've also contended with man-made changes to the site, such as the impact of the post-war looting by locals in the area who were searching for quote-unquote Jewish gold, and the establishment of large-scale memorials in 1965, which directly impacted the terrain. More primitive tools such as shovels and sieves are used, which require modification and repair, usually paid for by the archaeologist, to catch the smallest fragments of human remains and precious materials. The use of the sieve also requires direct tangibility in a process of selection, reflected of the epistemological process involved in forensic research. So the methods of excavation in the case of Sobibor also directly expanded the legacy and material memory of the camp, leading to new historical research and investigation beyond the limits of traditional research. At the same time, these kind of tools also reflect the smaller amount of funding dedicated to excavations in Poland, and less money is brought in internationally. Next slide, please. Since beginning, the archaeologists also unearthed approximately 11,000 personal belongings. As Caroline Sturdy-Cole suggests, sites that are devoid of physical evidence and remote in location like Sobibor must find alternate ways in which to engage with the public. One such alternative way is through the mediation of artifacts. Those uncovered throughout the excavations in Sobibor, including personal items such as eyeglasses, alcohol bottles, ladies' hairpins, wooden chess pieces, bottles, toiletries, tools, wedding bands, as well as perpetrator items such as bullet casings, have had substantial impact on public memory. The items with an obvious link to Judaism, or which bear a prominent Jewish symbol, are not as common, but thus have been characterized by the archaeologists as special findings. Through these, the memory of Sobibor and its Jewish victims can begin to be restored, as was diminished through the years of neglect and misplaced commemoration efforts. Most significant are the small number of identified artifacts, 14 in total, some of which have enabled us to reconstruct victims' biographies and even track down living family members. So next slide, please. So this is the case of a name tag belonging to a 6-year-old Dutch girl named Leah Judith de la Penha, who was deported from Westerbork, and a pendant belonging to Carolina Kohn, who had been deported from Frankfurt to Minsk before arriving at Sobibor. So as Anna Frank was thought to have owned a similar pendant as Carolina Kohn, the discovery of this item gained coverage around the world. And the uncovering of traces of Carolina Kohn's fate also resulted in building a stumbling stone in her hometown of Frankfurt. So the case of personalized items being discovered at the site of Sobibor is unique in terms of post-war excavations, that this hasn't been the case at Treblinka, for instance. And also with the excavations themselves, there are also underlying ethical and anthropological debates surrounding the discovery of these objects. So when they're excavated, they go to the State Museum at Majdanek, who owns now the site of Sobibor. So they retain every object unearthed during the excavation period. And this includes those for which we've been able to track down relatives due to their biographical identifications. However, the families are not permitted to take these items since they are expected to remain in Poland as part of the new museum exhibition. Much to the upset of the descendants that I've spoken with, they are not granted the privilege to touch them without wearing special gloves, as you can see on the slide here. Whereas I've even myself had done so during the excavations. So the most evocative instance of this tension is illustrated by the finding of a name tag uncovered during the archaeological phase of the area Camp 3. Next slide, please. The tag engraved with the name and address belonged to David Dedizak, a young Dutch Jewish boy who was born in Amsterdam on February 23, 1935, and murdered in Sobibor on June 11, 1943 at the age of 8. Following further research, archaeologists were able to reconstruct the fate of his family members, most of whom, including David's parents, were also murdered in Sobibor. But his cousin, Lise Carranza, survived the war in hiding and still lives in Amsterdam today. Informed about the discovery, Carranza was invited to a memorial service held for David by the Majdanek State Museum at the site of Sobibor later that year. So accompanied by her son, she traveled to Poland for the memorial, fully expecting to return to the Netherlands with David's name tag in her possession. At the ceremony, however, Lise Carranza was presented with a framed replica of the tag. So only after she returned to Amsterdam did she realize how upset she had felt about this. So in our interview, she told me, "I am angry about their refusing to give me back the original. I am legally the owner of the name tag, and it makes me angry because I cannot bear that something of my cousin stays in that terrible place where my family is murdered only because of legal rules," end quote. So by 2012, really, the archaeological team had already produced a new layout for Sobibor Death Camp, suggesting that previous excavations had provided unreliable in detecting mass graves and building fragments. So following the absorption of Sobibor into the branch of the State Museum in Majdanek, the new museum and memorial planning also began to affect where the team should and could research ahead of building plans and potential disruption of remains. From this period onwards, all material findings would be presented to Majdanek for further preservation, limiting the opportunity of the archaeologists to study them. At the same time, a discovery of numerous objects originating from the Netherlands also led to the participation of a Dutch archaeologist on site, Ivo Schutte, who joined the project in 2013 on behalf of the Ministry of Welfare in Holland. Schutte had already worked on other camp sites such as Westerbork, Bergen-Belsen, and Treblinka. So as a result of that, further investigations were permitted and carried out in the years that followed in cooperation with Schutte, which also ignited greater international interest, particularly from the Netherlands. In summer of 2014, when I joined, the exact location and the physical remnants of the gas chambers were uncovered, which was a fundamental aim of their overall project. Next slide, please. This discovery made headlines and was covered by German, Dutch, Israeli, British, and Polish media outlets, and was widely commended by international Holocaust scholars, showcasing the impact that archaeological excavations at killing sites like Sobibor can have. Similarly, the objects that we found during these specific excavations were quite remarkable. Unlike other areas of the camp, this area revealed material culture pertaining to the body rather than household items, for example. We found gold fillings, dentures, pendants, earrings, and rings. And what is most noticeable here is that all of these items, these were all the kinds of items that naked victims who had turned over their belongings before being marched to the gas chambers would have had on them, and thus proof that the bodies of the victims were indeed searched after they were murdered. This particular phase of the excavations, however, also led to a debate about the invasiveness of the large-scale archaeological digs at Sobibor, performed in coordination with the Polish rabbinical authorities in Warsaw. Although the archaeologists have encountered clandestine graves, previously undocumented in maps and research, mass graves were avoided at all times. When human remains are discovered, they are treated and reburied according to Jewish burial protocols. So in response to the question of why this area of the former gas chambers needed to be excavated at all, because the post-war testimonies and maps had already revealed the areas where these had been located. This relates back to the need for both the power of tangible proof, as well as the importance of a response to the planning of a new museum and memorial. So this is something that Caroline Studi-Coles refers to as reactive responses. This calls into question the ethical responsibility of Holocaust archaeology more generally, and in particular, our relationship to material culture in the context of genocide. As might be expected, the extensive period of excavation at Sobibor has not been without its conflicts and issues over the years. So in 2011, before the former campsite became the property of Majdanek, the State Forestry Administration attempted to have the archaeologists arrested for cutting down trees to complete their excavations that year. Their excavations have also inadvertently attracted the attention of Holocaust deniers, who in response have also launched personal attacks on the archaeological team. This is something that Caroline Study-Coles also experienced during her research in Treblinka. The former Reinhardt Camps, with less tangible evidence and official documentation than other sites, has always been the subject of revisionists, such as David Irving. Irving, who offers paid guided tours to the Reinhardt Camps, visited Sobibor during the excavations in 2014, the day before I arrived. But it seems, however, that the biggest conflicts the archaeologists have faced concerning the outreach and protection of their work is with the State Museum at Majdanek. Once the museum began to determine the goals of the excavations in response to their architectural planning, more issues began to arise, particularly in response to the uncovering of the gas chambers. Next slide, please. Following a visit to the site by Piotr Czerwiński, the director of the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, who insisted that these fragments be preserved immediately, a decision was made to apply 2 layers of insulation to the inside of the fragments, with a layer of Argo textile and thick construction film outside to protect them. This responsibility fell to Majdanek, who were advised by the archaeologists to cover them with sand until the former procedure could take place. A year later, the foundations were still exposed, and due to the harsh Polish winter that year, the remains were damaged further. In 2015, they were finally treated with a chemical substance, preserving most of them with the intention of making them visible to visitors through plexiglass. But ultimately, the advice and forensic research conducted by the archaeologists has often been neglected in favor of the memorial museum planning, even though their findings have formed the basis of their new exhibition. Archaeologist scholar Claudia Thury has referred to this as a kind of political education, whereby the archaeologist is indebted to the goals and vision of a memorial centre. Rarely were decisions made in coordination, and the exhaustive nature of the excavations at Sobibor were reflective of this. More intensive excavations needed to be done to ensure the safety of the material remains. But at the same time, incredibly important objects continue to be unearthed at every stage of the excavations, adding to their concern. So despite these debates, the unearthing of the gas chambers did eventually impact the memorial design in the former area of Camp 3. The director of Majdanek, Tomasz Kranz, stated, "We are aware of the fact that the architectural project of the museum at Sobibor, especially the commemoration of the road leading to the gas chambers, does not appeal to everyone." Moreover, around 700 objects from the excavations are now on display in the new museum exhibition, which opened in October 2020. Next slide, please. So not only has the archaeological research helped to determine the topographical and material memory of the camp, restoring a sense of Jewish victimhood, but they've also directly impacted the site's new cultural memorialization process. In short, this form of forensic research has absolutely shaped public awareness and understanding of the camp in ways we never thought possible. Yet, how these findings are integrated into the public memory remains the responsibility of the State Museum at Majdanek and the archaeologists respectively, as tensions remain and as future collaboration becomes less likely. So thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. So thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. That was a fascinating presentation. And of course, you presented the rich complexity of the situation in such a short period of time. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions coming in, which we will feed in again after our third speaker. So please feel free to send any questions for Hannah into the chat. So now I'd like to welcome Dr. Agnieszka Voltriska to present her research. She is our third panelist. Agnieszka?
Yes, hello. So first of all, do you hear me? Do you hear me?
All good, yes.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so let me start by saying that I'm very honored to speak here at this event today. I can say that I basically grew up with the work of Antony Polonsky. I think when the first volume of Pauline's Studies in Polish Jewry appeared, I was 5. Of course, that at that time didn't mean anything to me, but what I mean with growing up is the scholarly journey and also a very personal journey into the history of Polish Jews, which was only possible because of the articles and many books written or published by Professor Polonsky. So I can't even tell you how honored I am to speak here today. And this journey led me, my personal journey and scholarly journey led me to studying the research project about Polish-Jewish relations in the town of Tarnov. And this was my PhD project, which I finished 2 years ago, and I think the book will hopefully come out this fall. So I'll talk a little bit about the project and tell you what I was trying to do, and then I will concentrate on one set of sources that I find particularly rich in studying relations between Jews and non-Jews during the Holocaust. So when I started to research on relations between Jews and non-Jews in Poland, it became quickly very clear to me that I wanted to study one town. As you all well know, the grand majority of Jews in Poland before the war, before the Second World War, lived in towns, whereas the grand majority of non-Jewish Poles lived on the countryside. So towns are sort of a microcosm of inter-ethnic relations, of contact zones, of complex entangled realms where Jews and non-Jews met. So I decided to concentrate on one town, which is Tarnov. It is 50 kilometers east of Kraków. And it counted around 50,000 inhabitants before the Second World War, almost half of which were Jewish. And to concentrate on one town, sort of to narrow down the space which you are investigating in, allows us to sort of spread in time. So I decided to take into account the Second Polish Republic, then the German occupation, which also means to study how the Holocaust happened in the specific space of the town, and also the aftermath. So basically my study goes from 1918 to 1956. So what I didn't want to, however, do a local history of the town, but to really zoom into these specific realms of interactions and contact zones where Jews and Gentile Poles met, negotiated, collaborated, sometimes had common interests, and where as well the asymmetric power relations between Jews and Gentile Poles became visible. So let me tell you what I mean by these realms of interaction. For the Second Polish Republic, I concentrated on the city councils, and I looked at the ways in which Jews and Gentile Poles negotiated local power, but also the local financial funds, and the share of the Jews in the local politics and in the decision-making process. As you might imagine, this process was completely different than, for example, in the Sejm, because on the city level, the relations between who is a majority and who is a minority were completely different. In Tarnov, half of the electorate was Jewish. So the political parties, the coalitions, the electoral campaigns had to take into account that half of their potential voters were Jews. So what I analyzed were the minutes of the city council, but also the local press coverage and electoral campaigning, so leaflets, posters, and also official election documents. Another contact zone which was important for me were classrooms of the public schools. As you well know, 80% of Jewish children in the Second Polish Republic went to a public Polish school. So I looked at the minutes of teachers' conferences from these schools, which for Tarnov are preserved in the archives. And in these teachers' conferences, the teachers actually gave reports about what happened in the classroom, about the progress of the students, about their behavior. And of course, this is a perspective of the teachers on the children. But nevertheless, it gives us some insights, and I tried to sort of cross-read this source with memoirs of the Jews who went to the same schools. So this is for the time of the Second Polish Republic, but for the time of the Holocaust, I decided to structure the narration chronologically in order to show the process of radicalization, the process of the persecution of the Jews. But nevertheless, I try to focus on where we still have, or where we still can see these realms of interaction between Jews and local Poles. So I looked, for example, at the ghetto fence, and I asked what kind of, what goods, what information, but also how people were transferred through this ghetto fence. I looked at apartment houses where Jews were hiding, but I also looked at workplaces where Jews were led from the ghetto to work outside, and they usually worked together with non-Jewish Poles, and these were very important sites of obtaining food, of getting into contact with the outside world. I also endeavored a thick description of the first resettlement action in June 1942. This, of course, is a euphemism for the deportation of the Jews to the Beaujets extermination camp. And so just for the first resettlement action, which in Tarnov, excuse me, we are also doing homeschooling at the same time, so excuse me for this. Excuse me, I was talking about this thick description of the first resettlement action. Well, the overall numbers for the first week in June 1942 of this so-called Aktion there were 12,000 victims. 8,000 were deported to Beaujets, whereas 4,000 Jews were killed on site, mostly in the city center, in the Jewish cemetery, but also in the vicinities, in the forest. This is within a week, and this has been a very public massacre with blood on the streets, with also non-Jewish Poles who witnessed what was happening in town. And I tried to reconstruct it. The first day I reconstructed it almost hour by hour by using German sources, as well as memoirs of Jewish survivors and testimonies of Jewish survivors, but also of non-Jewish Poles who were at that same time, since there was no ghetto at that time in Tarnov, on the scene, on the spot, and who remembered very well what was happening. So this is an overview of what I was trying to do with these zones of interaction in my PhD, but now I want to focus on a very specific set of sources that I find extremely rich and pertaining to these relationships and everyday life in an occupied town in Poland. These sources are not very commonly used. Some historians have used this, such as Jan Grabowski. One of the reasons might be that they are scattered in the local archives, and so you have to really dig in the local archives to find these sources. And what I mean are the files of the prosecutor's office at the regional court. As you well know, the German administration did not dismiss all the courts in occupied Poland in the general government. There was a system of German courts, but some of the Polish courts, that is the regional and the city courts, were still functioning. They were, of course, functioning in matters that did not touch upon the German interests and where no Germans were involved. But these files contain investigations by the criminal police. And in Tarnov, these archives are preserved. And there are many boxes of these files of the attorney's office in Tarnov. And of course, I could file all of them, but a Tarnovian archivist actually made an index, a thematical index. And in this index, I found a column saying relations between Polish-Jewish relations. So I looked at these investigations on Polish-Jewish relations in the files of the prosecutor of the regional court. So let me tell you about some of the findings from these files. I was looking at the files in the year of 1942 especially. So in that year, the first resettlement action in June of 1942, which I was talking about earlier, took place. But also in September and November 92, there were two following actions as resettlement actions in Tarnov. So when in May 1942, 30,000 Jews lived in Tarnov, in December of 1942, so within half a year, 80% of the Tarnov Jews were killed. At the same time, after the first resettlement akcja, in June 1942, the ghetto was closed in Tarnov. So the ghetto was simultaneously closed to the physical annihilation of the Tarnov Jews. In March 1942, Gisela Guter filed complaint that she was being threatened by Gentile Poles, that they would denounce her to the Gestapo if they wouldn't pay a ransom. Gisela Guter was still selling goods in a shop, and she received an extortion letter saying that she would be denounced to the Gestapo because of selling illegal things at her shop. So she went to the Jewish Ordnungsdienst, and it was the Jewish Ordnungsdienst, or in the Judenrat, who then filed complaint, or who sent actually this extortion letter to the Polish criminal police. And then a Polish Polish criminal police officer, came to Gisela Guter and interrogated her about what happened. And she gave a very thorough testimony of how this extortion took place, who came to pick up the money. It turned out that it was a small boy of about 12 years who came to pick up the money, and she was talking about what this meant. So we have a very complex testimony about how extortion happened from a person that just lived this extortion. So it's not a memoir, it's not a post-war recounting of what happened. But I think one of the valuable things of this source is that they are showing us the way people talked about these complex relationships at this at the very time it happened. Gisela Guter did not survive the war, so that means that she could not give testimony after the war. She perished during the Shoah. So basically, this is the only evidence we have about this extortion and about her take on Polish-Jewish relations. Just shortly after this first resettlement action in June 1942, Zilla Regenbogen and her sister have to move to the ghetto, which was then, since June 1942, would be closed. So Zilla Regenbogen and her sister just lost her father in this first action, and they were packing their things to move to the ghetto. But the apartment was the doors and the windows of the apartment were broken, so they couldn't transport all the things at one time. And when they came back the next day, their things were a lot of their things were stolen. And she gives a complete list of what was stolen. This is also part of this source, that you have a complete list of things that were missing. So Zilla Regenbogen and her sister also went to the Jewish Ordnungsdienst 2 days after the resettlement aktion had finished and after her father had perished during this action. Again, a Polish criminal officer interrogated Zilla Regenbogen and her sister, and they also gave a detailed account of what had happened. But the Polish officer also interrogated the Polish neighbors, because of course the assumption was that someone might have stolen these goods. So these neighbors, obviously we don't know, all the cases were dismissed who stole the Regensbogen's goods, but these neighbors give an account of what they did that day. And they give an account which is very it's emotionally very hard to read because it's just a few days after this action had happened in town. And it's an account about, it's of course maybe an alibi, but it's an account of how the sons, where they worked, how they had someone from work had a party on their name's day. Then they went to the movies. So there's a whole explanation of, and an insight into the everyday life, basically in the middle of these 3 Aktionen that happened in Tarnov. And this is a very, I think that the source gives us a glimpse not only of what people actually did, but how they talked about it. Not after the Holocaust, but in the moment where it happened. It was something that seemed plausible to go to the movies on June 20th, 1942 in Tarnov. There's also another case of Alter Siedlisker, who broke into a shop in which that used to belong to his family, and he grabbed a lot of things. But the new owner of the shop, which was now a Gentile Pole, called the police. The criminal police investigated, and finally the things were the things were found, but also with the false papers that Alter Siedlisker had produced for himself, and which probably cost him an enormous amount of money. So we have all the documents of Alter Siedlisker in that file. We have his Kennkarte with the Aryan name. We have the Meldekarte für Juden. So and we have all these interrogations about who this shop belonged to. We have an account of the uncle of Alter Siedlisker, who was talking about what had happened during the day. So we really have insights into everyday life in occupied Tarnov in this very short period after the Aktion. We also have accounts of how non-Jewish Poles robbed Jewish property. We have these images of Poles coming with horse carriages to steal Jewish property, which we know from other towns, but for Tarnov, I can say that we hardly have any other accounts about robbing Jewish goods other than found in these files. So they really give a lot of information about what happened in the town. So what I wanted to show you today was that these files still hidden in the local archives, investigations of the criminal police on Polish-Jewish relations, are an extremely abundant and rich documents, and through which we can trace everyday life. People who are talking in these documents are people who a lot of times did not survive the war. So this is the only trace that we have from them and from their experiences. But the way people speak about what happened, the way people describe their situation is completely different to post-war memories or also post-war testimonies, for example, in the August Decree files. Because people, first of all, didn't know what will happen later, and they were within this context and situation which they were recounting. So for studying everyday life in the times of Holocaust and Polish-Jewish relations, this is a source still waiting to be investigated in the local archives. Thank you.
Thank you, Agnieszka. That was also fascinating. Another very interesting presentation on close reading of multiple sources to examine the relations and interactions in Tarnov. And I think this theme, of course, of close reading and contextualization runs throughout the 3 presentations on very different aspects of this history. So I'm going to turn now to the questions. I'm just going to stop recording because we did say we'll record the presentations, but just not the questions. So thank you to all 3 of our panelists for the benefit of those watching the recording later.